Good morning, good morning, good morning. I'm here at Friendly House with a good audience. So glad to see you all. HGP believes strongly in freedom of speech. Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists strive to lead meaningful and ethical lives and use reason and empathy to guide their decisions and actions. We live ethical lives because we honor the fact that this is the only life of which we are certain. As humanists, we affirm the dignity and worth of all people. We do this not only to acknowledge all that humans have accomplished in the arts and science and humanities, but also simply for the possibility for peace and well-being when people interact with respect for one another. Ann Henderson is our reader this morning. Ann, we always love your readings and very much appreciate when you volunteer to do this.
They have no need of our help, so do not tell me these haggard faces could belong to you or I, should life have dealt a different hand. We need to see them for who they really are. Chancers and scroungers, layabouts and loungers, with bombs up their sleeves, cutthroats and thieves. They are not welcome here. We should make them where they came. They cannot share our food, share our home, share our countries. Instead, let us build a wall to keep them out. It is not okay to say, these are people just like us. A place should only belong to those who are born here. Do not be so stupid to think that the world can be looked at another way. And now, another way. The world can be looked at another way. Do not be so stupid to think a place should only belong to those who are born here. These are people just like us. It is not okay to say, build a wall to keep them out. Instead, let us share our countries, share our homes, share our food. They cannot go back to where they came from. We should make them welcome here. They are not cutthroats and thieves with bombs up their sleeves, layabouts and loungers, chancers and scroungers. We need to see them for who they really are, should life have dealt a different hand. These haggard faces could belong to you or I. So do not tell me they have no need of our help.
Oh, yeah.
That's just the reverse. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, the Humanists of Greater Portland is a chapter of the American Humanist Association. And the American Humanist Association has developed 10 commitments, which are gentle guides that recognize behaviors that follow humanist principles. Our topic today, the climate crisis, corporations gambling with our lives, incorporates the humanist commitments of environmentalism and global awareness. I'd now like to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Martin Hart-Landsberg is a Professor Emeritus of Economics at Lewis and Clark College. He is the author of 7 books on issues related to globalization and the political economy of East Asia. He is chair of Portland Rise, a committee of Portland Jobs and Justice. He is also chair of the Oregon chapter of the National Writers Union. Dr. Hart-Landsberg, I just want to welcome you here today, and we really appreciate that you're here. We'll probably be taking questions at the end of your presentation. Very good. And all you got to do is relax, and I'll hand you the questions when you're ready.
Sounds great.
Okay.
And I'm delighted to be here.
Yes.
So let me start off with kind of the hardest and easiest thing to say, which is that we're destroying the conditions of livability on our planet. And there are lots of markers of this. Our oceans are becoming more acidified. Species are disappearing. We're losing arable land, and the land we have is getting degraded. And of course, global warming. And the list goes on. So I'm going to talk about global warming, and for 3 reasons. One is I think it's received the most attention among international researchers and the media. The second is because I think it's kind of an overarching problem, and that global warming contributes incredibly to the acidification of our oceans, the loss of species, the loss and destruction of arable land. So it's kind of a overarching problem. And the third is that even though a lot of Americans don't want to acknowledge global warming as a problem, the consequences of ever hotter years and the unstable weather patterns of storms and drought and wildfires, in particular for us, grows, and Americans are experiencing that. So I think global warming is a way in to help people understand issues and also to think about how we need to respond to them. So let me start by it's getting hotter. Global carbon dioxide emissions, which are generated largely by the burning of fossil fuels, which is the main cause of global warming, keep rising. They hit a new record last year. They're on pace for a new record this year. Last year was the hottest year in recorded history, and year by year, more Americans are feeling the consequences. The Secretary of Health and Human Services put it this way. He said, heat is no longer a silent killer. From coast to coast, communities are battling to keep people cool, safe, and alive due to the growing impacts of the climate crisis. Now, his agency published a total of deaths that are considered to be caused by heat, and it was about maybe 2,300. That was for last year. And most people don't accept that as an actual number. In fact, part of the problem is that death certificates, which determine why someone died, it's very hard to determine it was heat. There has to be certain body temperatures. Bodies have to be discovered at certain periods. And so studies that have been done using alternative methods have said it's at least 10 to 100 times greater. In fact, one in Miami-Dade County, officials hired researchers to try and give them a more accurate sense of heat-related deaths in Miami-Dade County. And the researchers basically said it was probably anywhere from 10 to 50 times higher. So this is already a big problem. And I think it's fair to say that 2024 is shaping up to be another scorcher year. Miami recorded its hottest May on record with temperatures reaching about 112 degrees. Phoenix had its hottest June ever. This is, early summer, with temperatures reaching 113 degrees. The Maricopa County heat-related death toll, the official toll, was 175. That was an 84% increase over the previous year. Much of the country was suffering from heat. The Guardian newspaper described in June said more than 270 million Americans, about 80% of the country's population, are experiencing a kind of heat wave not seen in decades, smashing records with temperatures at or above 90 degrees for long periods of time under a weather phenomenon known as a heat dome. And I think we all know that when we read a temperature of a city, that doesn't really give an accurate sense of what the extremes could be. I mean, there have been studies in Portland where the temperature could be 85, and yet in parts of Portland, primarily where communities of color and poor people live, it could be 10 to 15 degrees hotter because of the cement and the way the urban infrastructure is structured. And of course, we know the Pacific Northwest is no exception to this heat wave. Last July, we had temperatures of over 100 degrees in a number of our cities, and the Oregon Public Broadcasting pointed out that the abnormally high temperatures, part of a multi-year warming trend in Oregon, are promoting concerns about health in a state where many homes lack air conditioning. It was the hottest July ever in Portland, for example. Now, I'm focusing on deaths, and of course, we don't know what the true total is, but they're pretty high. But deaths is not the only problem that comes with heat. Heat takes a toll on workers, for example, in terms of the likelihood of serious injuries and long-term illnesses. And this is true for a lot of different workers, farm workers and landscapers, delivery and construction workers, factory, warehouse, and kitchen workers. All of these are people who suffer under enormous hardships when the temperatures rise. The Biden administration actually proposed some very minimal legislation, federal legislation, that says when temperatures rise to 80 internally or outside, companies had to provide a certain break or certain water. And if it gets to 90, they have to provide some cooling areas. It's not going to pass. Already, And the reason is business opposition. The governors of Texas and Florida, citing business concerns, actually passed laws. They signed legislation that make it illegal for local governments to provide heat protections for workers working outdoors in their states. I mean, this is, what we're kind of battling and dealing with. And it's also worth noting that as bad as the problem is getting in the United States, building up as the heat builds up, as the consequences build up, it's far greater in the global South. I mean, in places like India and Pakistan, there are temperatures hitting 126, 130 degrees. And, if in many of those countries, if workers don't work, they don't eat. So they work and they get sick, and the death tolls are extremely high. And, they don't have the luxury that we do of air conditioning. In fact, according to the World Bank, there's about maybe 800, 900 million people who don't have electricity in the global South. So air conditioning isn't even a possibility. Now, I think one of the reasons why a lot of Americans are kind of mixed about this heat wave is because of air conditioning. They envision, well, we can survive this. We have air conditioning to regulate our temperatures. But climate change generates its own challenges to this solution. And a case in point was just in May of this year, a major storm hit Houston, and it knocked out power for 1 million households. There was no lights, no air conditioning, and the damage to the infrastructure from the storm was so great that even after 5 days, more than 100,000 homes and businesses had no power. And if that storm had hit during a major heat wave, the death toll would have been very high. And researchers are beginning to recognize this. In fact, the number of major blackouts in the United States more than doubled from 2015 to 2020. So we're getting more and more of these because of global warming, these unstable weather conditions of storms and floods and fires that are causing blackouts. And so 3 university researchers undertook a study of the probable consequences of a major blackout during a heat wave, and they focused on 3 cities, Phoenix, Atlanta, and Detroit. And here's what they found. What they did is they said, let's determine the health consequences for residents in a 2-day citywide blackout during a heat wave with electricity gradually restored over the next 3 days. And in Phoenix, they concluded that 800,000 people, about half the population, would need emergency medical treatment for heat stroke and other illnesses. And the flood of people seeking care would overwhelm the city's hospitals. Likely more than 13,000 people would die. Now, they had lower totals for Atlanta and Detroit because temperatures don't get as high as they do in Phoenix, and because the dependence on air conditioning isn't as great. But we're talking about serious problems. And in fact, the rise in temperatures themselves are beginning to threaten more and more blackouts, because warmer temperatures means more air conditioning use, and that means more demand for electricity. And there's a rapidly growing demand for electricity, especially from data centers. I don't know if you follow all the artificial intelligence stuff that's going on, but there are data centers that are going up all across the country. And they are an amazing, source of demand for electricity. There are lots of parts of the countries now where cities and states are no longer closing down coal-fired plants because they can't get the electricity. So if you have these heat waves and more demand for air conditioning, at the same time these data centers are demanding more electricity, what you get is essentially the electric system overloads, and you get transformers exploding and power plants failing, and you get these crises. And in fact, according to some researchers who are looking at Arizona, they found the potential for cascading grid failures across Arizona to increase 30-fold in response to a 1.8 degree rise in summer temperatures. So that we're building in this crisis. And we've been able to kind of, suffer unpleasantness although not everyone can. Houseless population, workers in a number of professions are feeling it. It's punishing. So what are we doing about it? That becomes the more important and immediate question. Now, President Biden has touted his administration's many efforts to reduce our country's use of fossil fuels in order to lower greenhouse gas emissions. At its core, I think his energy strategy can be summarized as follows: electrify as much of the economy as possible, as quickly as possible, and use solar and wind power to do it. And the Biden administration has used a number of financial incentives and regulatory initiatives to push the economy in the desired direction. So we have, support for EVs, and we have support for, solar power, and we have support for a number of different initiatives that they're going to move us into this direction of different sources for our electricity. Ultimately, what the Biden administration is counting on is that market dynamics will build, that these attempts will kind of be a holding pattern until market dynamics, in particular, that the cost of solar and wind will get so cheap that the market will lead to their replacement from fossil fuels. So we need kind of a push, but then markets will lower the price of solar and wind power, and then private enterprise will carry us across the finish line. Well, this crossover happened about 5 years ago, where solar and wind power became cheaper than fossil fuels. And over this 5-year period, the difference is getting greater and greater, meaning that solar and wind are getting cheaper and cheaper than fossil fuels. Everyone acknowledges that. And yet, our fossil fuel use continues to grow. The US is the major producer of oil in the world for 6 years in a row. We are the major producer of natural gas in the world 4 years in a row. And although there's been a major, expansion of renewable energy production, it hasn't done anything to reduce the promotion, the exploration, and the production and use of fossil fuels. If you look just at electricity production, just one part of our energy system, the share of natural gas in electricity generation has continued to grow. A slower rate, but it's growing. It now accounts for 42% of all of our electricity production, fossil fuels, 42%. Coal share has been declining steadily, but even at its 2023 low of 16%, that is higher than solar and wind combined. Solar is about 4% and wind is about 10%. So what's happening is that we continue to rely on fossil fuel production, and the increase in solar and wind, which is real, is kind of taking up the slack because we have such an increased demand for energy. So it's not shifting the system. And the main reason that despite this cost change in price, we haven't seen a transition. We haven't seen fossil fuel companies saying, oh, wow, it's cheaper to produce, energy with solar and wind. Let's shift over, is because it's not profitable enough. There's a researcher named Brett Christophers who has been doing a lot of research on this. And what he's found, and I'm just going to summarize his argument, he says, bluntly stated, clean energy, developing and operating solar and wind farms and selling the electricity they generate simply isn't a very attractive business. Returns are typically in the 5 to 8% range. Compare that with oil and gas production, where returns generally exceed 15%, and it's little wonder clean energy stocks have been falling while oil and gas shares outperform. And as for the fallen stocks, S&P has a global clean energy index, which measures the stock performance of leading companies in clean energy, especially solar and wind. Since 1921, that index has lost more than half its value. Investors don't want to invest in it. it doesn't earn a high enough hurdle rate. And the researcher, Christopher, offers a number of possible reasons for this. Because at first you think, well, why would this be? And one of them is that renewable energy production is a very competitive industry. The costs to get into it aren't nearly as great as the cost to get into fossil fuel production, where you need huge land and huge equipment, and you need lots of surveys. And so it's difficult. It's very expensive. It tends to be a monopoly industry. We're trying to find space to set up wind farms or solar farms. It's much easier. And so the competition drives down the returns for that industry. The other big thing is that the companies trying to get into the solar production and wind production generally have to go to banks to get loans to do this. It's costly. They don't have the longstanding histories. And the banks evaluate this and they say the returns are kind of unstable. They've been going down. Stock prices are going down. And so they've been reluctant to make a lot of loans, where the fossil fuel companies self-finance. They have huge amounts of money, huge amounts of reserves. And so they essentially finance their own production. Regardless of the reason, despite the lower costs of solar and wind energy, fossil fuel companies are not shifting. And that's because it's profitability, not prices, that matter to them. And if you read the business press, they're very upfront about this. They're not embarrassed about this. They don't care about the consequences. So here's the head of Saudi Aramco saying, we should, look at the returns. We should abandon the fantasy of phasing out oil and gas and instead invest in them adequately, reflecting realistic demand assumptions. The head of ExxonMobil, looking at these returns, said, you can argue green all day and NGOs all day, but these returns are the facts, and we owe it to our stockholders. And so what we're seeing here is that if you just rely on the market, well, prices of this new technology will go down and markets will shift, we'll be okay. It doesn't work that way. And this notion of the energy price switch is just the latest in a long line of claims that markets will solve this problem of reducing the use of fossil fuels. And I want to give you two other examples, which are almost fading from memory now, even though they're not very old. But before I do that, I want to emphasize how important it is that we not continue to delay and trust capitalists and market processes to solve the problem. Because when they keep coming up with new ideas, well, we'll be able to pull air out of carbon, out of the air, and we'll bury it, or we're going to seed the atmosphere. Every time they do that, there's a sense, oh, technology will solve this, the market will solve this. What happens? We delay. And when we delay, we have more carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere. And here's the story. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can last anywhere from 100 to 1,000 years. And it can often take 10 to 20 years before higher concentrations of carbon produce higher warming. So all the time we're delaying, there's more carbon going up there and accumulating. And by the time we actually get serious and do something, we may have a warming temperature that will make large parts of this globe uninhabitable. So it's not just a matter of saying, well, we'll give them some rope and they can try this and try that. And then when we get serious and if it doesn't work, we can do something and then we'll be okay. It doesn't work that way. Every year, records are pumping out, record production, pumping out more carbon dioxide, could be sealing our future. And we won't know that for decades. So it becomes very important that we act. And so let me just give you some examples here of past claims. You may remember some of these things, but it wasn't that many years ago that we were told that the sustainable finance industry was going to solve things. They issued what was called environmental, social, and governance. They were called ESG rated funds. Maybe you've heard of these things. But so Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, they would offer these funds. And if you had money for your retirement or your savings, you could put them in an ESG fund. And ESG funds were supposed to be collections of companies who are following environmental or social or government's best practices. And the idea was, we're going to mobilize all this capital and direct it to companies that are doing great thanks to these funds. And so this is going to help drive the economy where we want. And these funds have grown very large. You know, worldwide, there's probably about $40 trillion in them. They've been really big business. Unfortunately, they've done absolutely nothing. And one of the reasons is, I mean, you can tell because when you actually study the difference between the funds in the ESG accounts and the funds in the non-ESG accounts, there's hardly any difference. And the reason is that the rating agencies are totally unregulated. So they develop their own ratings. You have a company will examine you. The company pays the rating company, of course. And we're going to examine you and see how you rate on your ESG criteria that we make up. And so, for example, ExxonMobil, they're doing great in the environment because they've gone paperless in their office. And they've issued a call for when you know people fly to try and cut the number of flights to conferences in half. It's that kind of thing. And so almost every company that's big makes it into an ESG fund. Now, the big investors aren't complaining, the big investment companies aren't complaining because we pay more to give Vanguard or BlackRock, excuse me, or State Street our funds because we think they're actually managing our money in a careful way to put them in ESG funds, right? Here's Bloomberg Business Week did an article on the shenanigans of the rating industry. It was called the ESG Mirage. And the subhead said it all. It said, MSCI, the largest ESG rating company, that's the company that all the big, you know, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, all the big companies use. The largest ESG rating company doesn't even try to measure the impact of a corporation on the world. It's all about whether the world might mess with the bottom line. So these were worthless, but we all put our money in them. We all thought global capitalism markets will you know, get what they want, but this is profitable. It's profitable for the rating agencies. They make all this money. Companies like to be rated by them because they know they'll get good ratings. It's profitable for the investment companies because they're charging higher amounts of money for managing funds that are pretty much indistinguishable from their other funds. And of course, we end up with an economy that doesn't change. And in fact, if you've been following the news, the bloom is really off of ESG because there's been a right-wing offensive against ESG funds. And here's a New York Times report I'm quoting. ESG has become a dirty word on Fox News and among Republicans in Congress. What followed is a growing conservative backlash against corporate, social, and environmental initiatives. About half of US states are enacting provisions to block efforts to invest in state-run investment accounts with an ESG lens. So if you're in states like Texas or Florida, lots of these states, the states can't put their money, the retirement accounts or anything, with an investment company that has an ESG fund. So these investment companies are kind of quietly withdrawing from ESG investing, not that it matters. But this was the big initiative. This was going to solve things. Another initiative is the carbon offsets. This was going to solve problems. Now, the claim was that carbon offset industry would enable companies that were unwilling or unable to reduce their carbon footprint to offset their carbon use by purchasing carbon offsets. Now, carbon offsets are a unit of carbon reduction. So if you are a company and you can't reduce your carbon usage and you've pledged to be carbon neutral by 2050 or something, then you would give your money to a company that would promise to invest in some activity that would reduce carbon, going into the atmosphere, like reforestation or things like that, windmills, things that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So their investment in these activities would balance out the carbon use and would enable companies that generate a lot of carbon dioxide to say we're carbon neutral. So this was supposed to be really big business. And remember that when a company emits carbon dioxide, it stays in the atmosphere for 100 to 1,000 years. One of the biggest carbon offsets in our area, in the Pacific Northwest, burned in 2021. You remember that big fire we had? It's gone. So all that is up there in the atmosphere, and what was supposed to be an offset is gone. And of course, the burning itself generated more carbon dioxide. So these are very tricky things. And the question is, how do we know that the money that companies give to a carbon offset manager will really go to something that's meaningful? And in fact, all the studies have shown they're really a waste. They're a boondoggle. People make money out of them. I mean, no one denies that capitalism finds a way to generate profits from activities. The question for us is, what's the benefit? So here, there was a big study done by the Guardian newspaper about on the top 50 emission offset projects. These projects have gotten the most money for carbon offset. And they found that 78% of them were likely junk or worthless due to one or more fundamental failings that undermined their promised emission cuts. Another 16% were judged problematic, quoting, with evidence suggesting they may have at least one fundamental failing and are potentially junk. So if you don't want to do the math, that leaves 6% that appeared to be fulfilling their promise. The Guardian described one, which was a giant forest conservation project in Zimbabwe that was reported to have had so many exaggerated and inflated claims that it was described as having more financial holes than Swiss cheese. Bloomberg reported that experts who looked at that project said the emissions cuts were overestimated by 5 to 30-fold. Moreover, a lot of the companies that were really big on these have now abandoned them. They no longer find it worth their while to do this. So for example, last year, Shell Oil Company appointed a new chief executive, and at his first investor meeting, he said the company was ending, which was at the time the world's biggest corporate plan to develop carbon offsets. The plan involved, among other things, in investing in projects that would sequester carbon with trees, gases, or other natural resources. Instead, said the chief executive officer, the company will concentrate on its main profit drivers, oil and gas. The Guardian also cited an example of the world's largest carbon capture and storage plant. Now, carbon capture and storage is the latest thing, and the Biden administration, again, in its recent environmental efforts, is subsidizing these things. The idea is that you'll pull carbon out of the air. You can either put it with an industrial plant that's spewing carbon or just taking it out of the air directly. And in fact, we have a long history of this carbon capture from the early 80s. But interestingly, what has been done is that the oil and gas industry captures some of the carbon that comes from their use. They only get about maybe 15 or 20%. But then they pump it into oil wells in particular that are nearing the end of their life, and it's hard to get the oil and shale out. And they pump that in there, and it pushes up the oil and shale they want to get at. So that's the great majority of what carbon capture has been used for. Gets very little, pumps it in the ground, and of course it goes up. So we now have the largest carbon capture and storage plant in the world. It's in Wyoming and it has a lot of subsidies. But according to a study by the New York Times, the vast majority of the, actually, no, the Guardian, excuse me, the vast majority of the captured CO2 has been released into the atmosphere or sold to other fossil fuel companies to help extract hard to reach oil, according to the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. So what's the takeaway here? We get these promises: cheap solar power, wind power, market doesn't work that way, not profitable. ESG investing, too much profit involved in continuing on. Offsets, profitability, all these things. And what that means is that year after year, we pump out more carbon dioxide. The planet continues to warm. And why, the title, Gambling with Our Lives, is that, these corporate heads are not stupid. And most of them have known for a long time about global warming. They don't feel like it's a crisis for them. The worst effects have been in the global south. Even when they're in the United States, it's been poorer people, communities of color, lower wage workers who are feeling the problem. Someday it may get bad enough for them to care about. And they're probably figuring that when it does, the government will offer them huge incentives to investigate technologies that may or may not work. They're just gambling with our lives. That's the thing. These are efforts that they keep putting forward to solve things. Now, it's not too late to take meaningful steps. The climate science is scientists associated with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, sort of the main scientific group of people who are studying global warming, have argued that we court danger if we allow the Earth's average surface temperature to rise more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above that of the pre-industrial era, and that's like 1850 to 1900. So if they said if we can keep it within 1.5 degrees Celsius above that, life as we know it now can probably continue. So that was the target that was adopted by the 2015 Paris Climate Conference. The scientists were also clear, though, that if you broach the 1.5 degrees Celsius, it wasn't like going off a cliff and then the world ended. But every degree higher made things worse. Right? How bad might things get? According to studies that were done by scientists associated with the IPCC, if we allow a 2.7 degrees Celsius temperature rise, 2 billion people, it's about 25% of the Earth's population now. I think we're about at 8 billion. So 2 billion people would be pushed outside humanity's climate niche, the benign conditions in which the whole of civilization rose over the past 10,000 years. 2.7, at least 25% of the population will no longer be able to live where they're living. The conditions will become uninhabitable. With a 3% rise, cities including Shanghai, Rio de Janeiro, Miami, The Hague would end up below sea level. 3 and above, you have tipping points with storms ricocheting around, water, food shortages, destruction of agriculture. It's unclear what would happen. As for the current trend, according to the UN climate chief speaking at the June 2024 meeting of the International Energy Agency, he said, the best evidence shows the planet is on track for, in his words, ruinously high 2.7 degrees Celsius rise in temperature. That's the rise, as is now, of maybe a quarter of the population no longer being able to live where they live because the conditions become inhospitable. And it's gotten so crazy. I'm an economist by training, and economists who have studied climate warming basically do so disregarding the climate evidence. they have developed models, and I'm not exaggerating, where in order to estimate what would happen to us with climate rise, they say things like, well, let's see, people work indoors, so they're not going to be affected by a climate rise. So what sectors of the economy would be harmed by climate increase? And then let's do some econometric studies that look at when climate rises, how much is agriculture go down, how much is this? And then we model some of these feedback. They have no sense of what can happen. And the fact that climate crisis isn't restricted to only outdoor workers. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy. And of course, these kinds of studies are cited by people who in the corporate community for saying, you know, there's nothing wrong. In fact, these models commonly say three degrees Celsius rise is fine. It'll cost us more to try and do something. So we're facing a situation where the mainstream profession and the corporate community, you know, don't want to budge. Now, we need to act. We don't know where we are. We don't have to go to 2.7. If we go to 2.7, we don't have to go to 3, right? We need to do something. And I think that means that we have to transform the way we live and work. And the starting point for that has to be a reduction in the exploration, production, use of fossil fuels, and the ramping up of clean energy sources like solar and wind. Obviously, that's not going to happen by markets. There's going to have to be some government interventions. But we have to be clear that we can't just reduce fossil fuel use and ramp up wind and solar on a one-to-one basis. Solar and wind often require certain critical raw materials, which are difficult to mine. They create mining them creates their own ecological problems, especially for people in the global south. There's limited supply. We need to figure out a way to lower our overall energy use while we switch the power we use. So we can't use as much energy. How do we do that in a way that's responsive to the living and working conditions of the great majority? And here we need to do things like reduce the production of ecologically destructive and socially less necessary goods and services. Large single-family mansions, giant sports utility vehicles, private jets, luxury cruises, fast fashion, industrial produced meat and dairy, single-use disposable products. And because the Department of Defense is the single largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world, and you know that the climate conventions that meet when they talk about, you know, who's using what, who's responsible for what, they don't include militaries in any of those calculations. The Department of Defense, by numerous studies, is the largest producer of greenhouse gases in the world. That has to be reduced. Our spending, our projection of power has to be brought down. All of those things will begin to greatly lower the demand for energy. And if we're ramping up solar and wind in a responsible way, the amount of energy that we can create should be sufficient to allow us to support a number of things that are important, like a well-funded national healthcare system, a universal education system, accessible and affordable public housing, an expanded system of affordable public transportation, support for regenerative agricultural practices. And you know, it's easy to say these things, they sound like, well, healthcare service, but these are major job creators. You know, if you're going to build clinics, it's construction work. If you're going to put in equipment, x-ray machines, or whatever you put in, you have to produce them. If you're going to train doctors and nurses, you have to have schools that do that. If you're going to retrofit buildings, there's a lot of jobs that come. So we begin to create a different sector of jobs supporting different services. Now, it's easy for me to just sort of say that. I mean, we could all sit down and write the things we want to cross out these and we want to add these. And part of the problem is because after decades of unchallenged neoliberal policies, people can't imagine how this can happen. It just sounds like pie in the sky. And one of the reasons why we have such difficulty winning support from the building trades, a lot of workers for these things like shutting down fossil fuels and doing is, you know, what's going to happen to our jobs? And we talk about, a just transition. We're going to move from this to this, but they don't see anybody planning these things. They don't see anyone taking seriously the process of doing that. And there are a lot of different tasks in restructuring an economy, how we live. You need some new industries. You have to develop them, and you have to develop them rapidly. And for other industries, you have to upgrade the productive capacity pretty quickly. And you need to create agencies capable of deciding the speed of growth, as well as the ownership of these industries. Who's going to own them? How fast are they going to come online? Who's going to finance the investments? How do you ensure that the materials that they need will be ready at time and provided in the right place? You have to develop mechanisms for deciding, well, where are you going to locate the new plants? What cities? If they're going to be in cities that with a lot of unemployment or cities without a lot of industrial development, how do you ensure the social infrastructure for the workers that come in, for the daycare, for water and power and all those things? So any system-wide transformation is going to involve a lot of moving parts that has to be managed and coordinated. And people have it seems like pie in the sky. And yet, I think if we look back to our history, and here I'm going to talk about the World War II conversion experience, you can see that such a transformation can happen. It's not necessarily perfect, but an economy in World War II was transformed from civilian to military in 3 years, right? It was done, and it was done by trial and error. And while you can point out all the shortcomings, it succeeded in making that transformation. Yes, there are a lot of differences between then and now, and I'll highlight some differences, but there's some similarities that planners faced then that planners will face now. Most importantly, there was an immediate need for a system-wide transformation. To fight the war, you needed to build the capacity to produce the military equipment and train the workers and so on and so forth. We have a need for a system-wide transformation. We're continuing to just generate all sorts of carbon and warm the planet. The other interesting thing is back then, big business resisted that transformation. The planners had to engage in that transformation over the opposition of big corporations, just like we will have to do. People have this idea of World War II as we all rolled up our sleeves. I've had long sleeve shirt, I'd roll up my sleeves. And we all got to work. The fact is, big business did not want to undertake the investments. In fact, they didn't want any government involvement. Corporations producing goods that were critical to building up the war industries, like aluminum and steel, they refused to invest. In fact, their investments hardly grew through the entire war. Why? How long will the war go? We invest, we have a big company. What are we going to do with that excess capacity? Even if the government was going to take it over, what if they sold it to a competitor? And what if we lose the war? And what? And so they resisted. They wouldn't do it. In fact, overall private investment fell of the years 1941 to 43 by a huge percent. In 1943, private investment, so this is well into the war years, into the transformation, that year it was 37% below what it had been in 1940, where we were still, not even entering into the war buildup. They were largely absent, private investors. At the same time, there were corporations producing consumer goods, most importantly, the auto industry, that were gobbling up all sorts of raw materials that the military needed to produce things, and they refused to stop producing. It's profitable. We're making, the economy's rolling. People want cars. They want all these things. We're not going to stop producing. I mean, these are the same kinds of challenges we're going to run into now, right? Business doesn't want to do things that they think will threaten their profits. So the US government succeeded in transforming the economy from civilian to military, creating the celebrated arsenal of democracy, only because It undertook the required spending, investing, and planning. So let's start with spending. And just when I say military, think of environmental, needs. Military spending as a share of GDP rose from about 1.6% in 1940 to 36% by 1944. As a result of that spending, the combined output of the war-related manufacturing, mining, and construction industries doubled. In 1944, federal purchases of goods for the military accounted for 1/2 of all goods produced. You want to transform the economy? Spend money on the military, production begins to move. But how? How did that happen? The economy didn't just respond to this spending. When private businesses won't invest, it responded because the government undertook the investment. An example, in 1940, the government created what was called the Defense Production Corporation. It was a spinoff from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was a Depression-era vehicle that was used to try and keep banks from failing. So it stayed around, and the government just added a new subset to that, which meant that the Defense Production Corporation could finance anything it wanted with an unlimited budget. It didn't have to go to Congress to ask for money. So what it did was it decided what industries needed to expand or to start, like synthetic rubber was a brand new industry. They started it. But production of tanks or airplanes needed more capacity. And they decided, we're going to build this plant. They would go to a company and say, we will build this plant and we will own it, but we'll lease it to you for a minimal amount of money and you will run it. It's our plant. We own it, we control it. The Defense Production Corporation financed and owned about 1/3 of all the plants and equipment built during the war. Right? The Navy and the Army built and invested in a lot of shipbuilding and other things. Altogether, the federal government accounted for about 70% of all the investment during the war. It was not private industry. When you see signs, or I mean, if you ever read histories and the auto industry is proud of all the tanks that they built and all these kinds of things, and they had them, they had newspaper people come. All those facilities were not in. It wasn't the auto companies that paid for those facilities or trained those workers. It was the DPC, the Defense Production Corporation, that built those facilities and allowed the auto companies to operate them to produce the tanks. So we would not have gotten the explosion of production if we had just waited for private enterprise. And I'm just going to quote here. It's a little bit long, but it's an easier way for me to get numbers out to give it to you. At the end of June 1945, when the DPC was finally terminated, it owned 96% of the capacity of the synthetic rubber industry, 90% of the capacity of the magnesium metal industry, 71% of the capacity of the aircraft and aircraft engine industry, 58% of the aluminum medical industry, and sizable investments in aviation, gasoline, ordnance, machinery and machine tools, transportation, radio, and other more miscellaneous facilities. It did other things. Machine tools were really critical to building the war stuff. And private enterprise was a little reluctant. So what the Defense Production Corporation did is they went to machine tool companies and said, you build, we'll give you a 30% upfront. And after 1 month, if you can't sell your machine tools, we'll buy it from you and take it, because we know as the military ramps up, they're going to need more machine tools and we'll have them. But if you can sell them to private industry who are producing, like the auto industry, the shipbuilding industry, then you give us back the 30%. And so they intervened in that critical industry and stimulated its production so that there could be there weren't bottlenecks, in other words. Now, this whole process also required detailed planning. For example, you had to free resources for the new war industries. So new agencies were created to say, stop producing tires and start rationing them, stop producing automobiles, stop producing washing machines. So they went in and told companies, some companies, you have to stop producing. Others, they said you can produce only a certain amount. So this huge production miracle was accompanied by the fact that non-wartime production actually declined by about 10 to 20% over this period. They shifted resources, which is what we need to be doing, right? Shift away from certain things to other things. Now, planning was even greater than that, because initially the military said, you know, the idea was the military would just go to all their prime contractors, you know, we want a tank, we want a submarine, we want a battleship, we want this, you know, we want landing, you know, whatever. And all these prime contractors would then rush to say, well, we need steel, we need these components, we need, and it was crazy. And the economy couldn't produce them as fast. So what would happen is one company would get enough something to start, but the other company would buy up the supply of what they needed so they could start. And there were all these unfinished products and inflation and hoarding, and the war production was collapsing. And so what happened is the government created agencies that went in and said, we're going to have control over all the raw materials and all the prime components, and you military and you merchant marine and you know, all the different parts of this, you need to submit to us what you're going to need, and we will decide how much we have and allocate them accordingly. And we even decide about 60 critical parts and components. You only need them in January, so we're not going to give them to you now. I mean, you need them now, we'll give them to you now, but somebody else isn't going to need more till May, so we're not going to let you hoard them, and we'll move them around. And they literally did that. They planned the distribution of critical metals and critical components. And they brought the military down to understand what the capacity of the economy was, but continued to push at its limits. You needed other agencies to decide where to locate these new factories. And we funded an entire system of public funded community-controlled daycare centers all across the United States. All of these things happen through agencies. And despite all the government efforts to get the corporations on board, allowing high profit margins on corporate activities, allowing business representatives to occupy important positions in planning, business was critical all along. They would say things, I'll just read you a few quotes, I'm almost done here. The head of Sun Oil said, you know, if we allow government to intervene on all these things, Hitler's going to win even if Hitler loses, because government's going to control the economy. The head of GM said, I wonder if it's not as essential to win the peace in an economic sense as it is to win the war in a military sense. So all of these, throughout this whole process, there was resistance and struggle by corporations against it. And not surprisingly, it was a very tumultuous affair. And when the war ended, corporations got themselves in positions of leverage to get the government to sell them at very cheap prices, all the factories that the government had paid for and owned, and to disband all the planning agencies to allow market processes to run. So what to say about all this? Planning is not some mystical thing. We have real experiences to learn how to do these things, but it's not part of our sense of things. So the demands we make, you know, will private enterprise do this? How do we set, is going the wrong way. We need to understand that a rapid transformation can happen. We need to understand that public policy has to play a critical role in financing, ownership, and direction of activities. And it highlights that anything that's going to happen is going to meet tremendous resistance. And so what we need to begin to do is not only have confidence that we can do something, but we need to begin to build a political movement that starts to talk and recognizes that if you're going to make such a huge system transformation, the labor movement, the environmental movement, the community movements have to be having conversations. How do we conceive of planning? What are planning institutions like that will be responsible to our interests? What's our vision of this? And how do we begin to anchor a big movement that starts to put pressure and develops our public capacities to transform our economy? And I think yes, it's a big challenge, but it's not an impossible challenge. And I will end there. Thank you.
Climate change was explained to me by my father as a meteorologist in 1949 when I was 8 years old, and we've done nothing as far as I can see. And I don't see anybody in the population that's anywhere that cares. Is the Green Party the one to do this? What's the end stage of this? I mean, it's got to be a horrible war. And you're going to need a dictatorship.
We got your question. We got your question. Go ahead.
Shall I answer in?
Yes, please.
Okay. Well, I mean, my problem with the Green Party isn't so much that their principles are bad, is that they're not building a party. They emerge every 4 years to run, a thoughtful candidate, but we need to be building something that has an ongoing presence, that does political education, that gets involved in movement building. I think part of the problem is, you're absolutely right that there are people who've known about this, and even oil companies have known about it since the 70s, but people can't envision what to do about it. And I think that's where in my mind, the kind of conversations of saying, and I guess for me, one way to begin to help people think about it is to think about it as part of a bigger system transformation.
Okay.
Right now, people say, well, we need to stop using fossil fuels or recycle or do things individually. And we wonder, does it really amount to anything? And I think the kind of crisis we face is one that has to be seen as a part of a bigger one. And so it's my hope that if we start getting movements that are pushing, we have climate justice movements, and we have labor movements, and we have student debt movements, and we have transportation movements. How do we get them together and get them to see that climate is a problem, but planning a new economy is a way to think about answering it? So I think we need to end silos and get climate seen as part of an overall challenge facing us that also includes a new economy that has to be responsive to these other things. It is not easy. I mean, I'm not optimistic, but I think one can speak to helping people see a way forward, that it is possible to think about an economy as something that could be made to serve us if we suppress private capital, if we no longer rely on markets and profitability to guide us there. And unfortunately, I think that ideological struggle is very important. And the more we can do that in our groups, to challenge our groups as we put forward demands, how are we equipping people to understand what needs to be done and what's possible? That's where I think change has to happen. And we see some things like the UE, the United Electrical Workers, has a program called the Smart Locomotive program, where they're trying to force, with environmental groups, the locomotive makers to create energy efficient locomotives and get the federal government to force the railroads to buy them and transform rail systems. And you have in places like Canada, where GM is closing a facility, you have workers trying to get the provincial government to buy that facility and produce EVs for mail carriers and school buses. And so I think if we start to think about planning and tapping workers' knowledge and committing with environmental and community groups a different way of thinking about things, we begin to develop capacities and confidence, and then things can happen quickly. I'm organizing movements. I work within the labor movement. I welcome opportunities to talk to your group, which is, a community group. I don't see at this point a party doing anything, because there's not a push. There's not force. And that force is going to have to come from all of us making demands and building capacities.
Okay. Questioner number 2 here at Friendly House.
So I have 2 really quick little questions.
Okay.
One is, so when these carbon offset forests burn, does anything happen? Does it just be counted as, oh, well, they invested their money, they didn't get any carbon offset for it, oh, well, that's how it goes? And the second question is, you mentioned, it sounded like the profit margin on wind and solar are not as large as the profit margin on gas, if I understood correctly.
Yes.
And yet you stated that wind and solar are cheaper than wind and solar are cheaper than oil. So I'm wondering,
Okay.
are you comparing apples to oranges there? I mean, what about wind and solar with the profit margin? How does that compare with oil with profit margin?
Okay. The first thing about the carbon offsets, there's no law requiring them. So when it burns, you say, oh, well, because, the business says, I think it was Microsoft was one of the major investors. Oh, well, we tried. So what you see is a lot of these companies are now walking back their commitments to be net zero by 2050. They no longer see these things as viable, but they can just say, oh, well. As for the other, the question is, if you have money, it's not so much that, you have, in order to, I'm not talking about the cost of wind turbines necessarily, but the actual creation of, the facility and the transmission lines and all the things that the new power would require are very expensive. And even though the actual cost, once you have them in place, is cheap, the return on investment for that kind of activity tends to be low. And so the oil and gas people are saying, we get a higher return on a dollar investment in opening a new reserve someplace than we would buying, starting a business to put wind farms in. Because it's anyone can do it, so the returns are kind of low, and so people aren't investing in those businesses. They can't raise money. I guess is one of the problems is they can't raise money, and even when they start to, the question is, where do the transmission lines come from? And that's expensive, and so because they're geographically limited in that way, and so it becomes very expensive, and they can't charge enough to make it as profitable. Now, you and I might say 5 to 6% profit, that's sufficient. Let's suppress that. That's good enough. But in a capitalist market, that doesn't work that way.
We have a question from Joyce. What possible motivation can be stronger than actual war? Or do we draw as many comparisons to war as possible? And we faced a real enemy. This seems more elusive, climate change.
It does seem more elusive, but it's also worth remembering that even with war, companies weren't interested in doing the things. I mean, they were, gambling with our lives is a good way to even say it then.
Right.
A lot of them say, well, if we win, we'd rather lose in a way than have our government take us over. So I think the challenge, I think the issue becomes more concrete if we can begin to get people to see what a process of transformation can look like. Otherwise, it's this, it's getting warmer. We have, air conditioning. Well, if we don't have air conditioning, it's going to get hot. But what do we do? And people don't have a sense of what to do. And so for me, where I started to get empowered was studying. As an economist, I studied East Asia. And when I started studying places like Korea and Taiwan, they went from nothing to success stories. And the reason was they had enormous state capacities. Both countries, the state owned the entire banking system. You couldn't take money out of the country. The banks had to invest where the state said. The state controlled, the infrastructure. The states directed a process. It can be done. And so if we begin to develop that capacity, and one of the obstacles, the question is, back in the 30s, in wartime, people were suspicious of corporations because of the Depression, and they were somewhat favorable to government because of the New Deal. So they were more willing to accept this. Right now, people, who are our great stars? It's our job creators. It's, we love these people, these entrepreneurs who are giving us AI into everything. And we don't think the government's good at all. And so that's a major challenge for us. And so then the question is, What kind of organizing do we do? How do we understand these things? How do we challenge people's understanding of what these job creators are really doing for us? And you know, it's a slow process, but things can happen quickly. And the question is, you know, what's our direction? What are we trying to communicate to people? Not just individual recycling, but a wholesale recognition that markets aren't working for us in many ways, and a question of how to begin to think about public planning. One last thing. This is a history that I discovered by accident. World War II, we had price controls. You know how they worked? That's rationing. Price controls, the government set dollars and cents limits on about 250 goods, and volunteers were organized, many housewives in particular, and some returning veterans, who would go out to stores, demand to see the prices, look at them to the actual goods, and if there was a violation, they could report them to an all-volunteer board who could threaten them with loss of license. We ran a whole price control system with minimal public employees. People stepped forward, and rationing was done by all volunteer boards. There's a capacity to rethink how we do things. We need to reclaim our history, I guess, and develop a sense of confidence in what we can do.
Questioner 3 here at Friendly House.
Capitalism is a problem. Changing behavior is a problem. We're familiar with Chicago Boys economics, neo-capitalism, Reaganomics, and all that. My question is, do you know, like in teaching economics now, are you aware of any concepts of steady state economics, possibly even becoming national policy and embracing less GNP and going more to other ways of measuring our wellness?
There are people who are raising these other visions, but if you're looking for an all-encompassing, I would say kind of, you know, degrowth theory. There are lots of theories about these things. I think what's really missing is a sense of mechanisms. You know, where capitalist economics has the virtue of just saying, you let the market do it, right? We don't know, you know, businesses are black boxes, and we don't really, you know, need to know about what labor exploitation is about. We just let markets work. And so it becomes very simple. And most of mainstream economics is really ideological training in support for markets. You know, when we had the big debates about free trade, and we would get studies from the IMF and World Bank saying, you know, globalization is good, NAFTA is good, the WTO is good. If you looked at their studies, they had these huge sophisticated models, way beyond my ability to model. And I was undergraduate math and computer stuff, but this was big. But they had to make assumptions. Their assumptions would be full employment, balanced trade, and no capital mobility. And then they would get this world. And so a large part of what's required is breaking through this ideological stuff and getting people to think about running an economy. And I think there are visions of steady state, of degrowth, of, you know, all sorts of different visions that are competing, even different ways to measure, you know, human development rather than GDP. But I think with those as models, the question is, how do we get there? And I think one of the first things is that doesn't happen much in economics, unfortunately, is this challenge of neoclassical economics of the market. And then the second is building our sense of how one replaces the market with planning. Is it decentralized planning? Is it centralized planning? Studying real life examples of how things have taken place and equipping people to make decisions and to offer advice.
Thank you. We have a question from Hank. How was it established that the federal executive was allowed to spend money without going to the federal legislatures to get authorization to do so during the war?
Yeah, so during the Depression, banks were going bankrupt. People were pulling money out. So the federal government, the Congress approved the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was essentially given unlimited money to go in and buy stocks in the banks, to keep pumping money into the banks so that they would, they would buy assets that were depreciating or buy stock to help them stay liquid so they could keep running. And then when the Depression ended, the authorization for that ended. But the Reconstruction Finance Corporation stayed on the books. So in May of 1940, Congress passed a resolution because the initial Reconstruction Finance Corporation said this corporation has the power to establish any agencies necessary for the stability and success of the U.S. economy in meeting its need, very boilerplate. And so they said, okay, we're going to establish a subsidiary that will be for the defense. And it had the ability to draw from the Federal Reserve any dollars it needed to invest. And it was given that. And it had to report quarterly what it was doing. But again, it was one of those things where, if you look at free markets, they say, oh, there's always equilibrium. You wonder how do recessions happen if there's always equilibrium, all these kinds of things that go on, business cycles. But yeah, there was some, issues of but they got the money out, they built the factories, they did it, and they were able to do it quickly because they were essentially entrusted. And I think one of the other things that's really important when I studied the Asian economies, people who graduated from school, the best wanted to work for the government. They got paid, they got respect, they did important work. You go to some of our best schools, like the Harvards and Yales, 2/3 go to work for finance. Working for the government, you take a lot of crap and you're blamed for things. And so I think it's also partly rebuilding a sense of pride in doing public work that becomes important. And so people trusted, I guess is a long way of saying it, that in the midst of an emergency, the right decisions would be made.
Thank you. Am I on question 4?
You keep talking about that capitalism doesn't work. There's something in our legal system, this idea that corporations must maximize profit. That's the law. That's become sort of the law now. But it's a hoax that kind of got slipped in there by accident. Is anybody working on trying to correct that rule? Because that
Question. You got your question.
Is anybody working on trying to get that thing? Is anybody?
Well, this is contrary to what you're saying, but capitalism does work very well for capitalists. I mean, that's the issue is that, we say it's not working. It is working. They are making lots of profits. And so, I mean, you weren't saying the opposite, but I just thought it was important to make that. Mm-hmm. There are lots of challenges. I mean, part of the problem is we have the Supreme Court. Are corporations human beings? But also, fiduciary responsibility is a debatable term. Does fiduciary responsibility mean doing the right thing for the long term, for 6 months? All these things become, as moods shift, interpretations change. And in my mind, that's kind of a long run battle, but getting government action shifts how corporations see things. Government says, we're investing in these and we're going ahead, and this market's going to get filled and you're not going to be there unless you see this as in your fiduciary responsibility. And it may be that in terms of the oil companies, we're going to have a public takeover. That they have so much in their fields, they call stranded assets, that and the Biden administration has given them 5 new leases to explore for more oil and gas. And so as they get them, then they're going to say, well, what are we going to do with them? Are you telling us we're stranded assets? So at some point we may need to have a takeover of these companies and bite the bullet and shut them down, or not overnight, but gradually reduce and not use those leases. It's going to be big, but people change how they understand what corporations are. It used to be corporations were chartered for one particular market. And now we say corporate charters, we don't renew them. We don't review them. There have been movements to go back and say, what is a corporate charter? Why are they all in Delaware, for goodness sake? and how do they get them? And what does a charter enable a corporation to do? So I think those are all things that are important. I'm not sure they have the, I mean, I think once the urgency starts to challenge corporations and move in a different direction, these things will get more publicity and take on more urgency themselves. As they exist now, as just kind of attempts by thoughtful people to improve things, I think that, they come up against a wall.
We have a questioner on Zoom. Suzanne, can you come in and ask your?
Yes, thank you, Martin, for the presentation. To make it more personal for us here, take away, if we had some money, and some of us do, where would we put it? Where would we put our investments?
I appreciate the question, but I'm not going to offer anything for two reasons. One is, I really don't think about that too often. And investment is not my area. And I would feel bad if I sort of said, yes, I think this is a growth area and maybe it will be in 10 years, but not in 2 years. And I just think it's too much responsibility for someone who knows too little. So I appreciate the question, and it is one that's not an unreasonable question, but I have to just say, as a political economist who tries to look at these, big things, it's really outside what I know. I mean, I remember when I was teaching at Lewis and Clark, I would teach international economics, and we would get business students, and their interest was, well, if I'm a treasurer of a multinational and I'm putting assets over different countries, how do I parlay foreign exchange movements? And I'm looking at the big picture of, of what's happening to, dollar sustainability and how it's causing debt crises. And my knowledge and expertise goes a very different direction. And those are important questions. And there are people who have expertise. I'm not one of them.
Our time, unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you. You've given us so much to think about. It's big. It's so big, and it's such a struggle.
Yeah,
such a struggle. Just in closing, what crossed my mind is that just supporting things like the Paris Climate Agreement, that coming together as a world and making this a world issue as much. The United States can do so much, but we're a world leader.
Yes.
We're a leader, and
Yes.
so that we have to recognize
Yeah.
our power in making this happen.
Well, I just want to say I really appreciate the opportunity to
Yeah.
come and talk with you all. And I mean, I share the sense that it's huge, but on the other hand, there's some clarities that we can have. It is a crisis. We can't rely on private capital.
Right.
We need to begin thinking about how to develop the capacity to plan. And that's going to mean making connections and having conversations with other groups. And, it's a start. And I think it's in conversations like this that I sharpen my own thinking and learn. And hopefully, you come out with a different way of seeing things. And it's what we need to be doing. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Martin, so much.